So this is what I sort of really love doing with teachers is going, okay, you have this kid who's like a hectic problem and the behaviors keep happening. Walk me through what's like a classic example. Walk me through what happened right from the very beginning to what happened next, what happened next, what happened next. And we can start to sort of unpack or pick apart where some of the reinforcement, inadvertent reinforcement in particular, might be happening, right? And so this is just like a small example of this. And this is really teeny tiny, and I apologize for the font size, but I'll read it out for you. So a classic example is you have a child who leaves group reading time together to go and play on the trains at the back of the group. Teacher says, come back to the mat, please. Child replies saying, no, I want to play with the trains. I don't want to read. Teacher raises voice more sternly and says, it is time to read as a group. Please come back to the mat now. Child escalates, yells, no, leave me alone. I want to play with the trains. I hate reading. Teacher sort of looks at the 28 other students in front of them, sort of goes, too hard basket today are picking the battles, withdraws, continues on with the book, ignores the child. Child immediately quietens down, plays with the trains, but doesn't necessarily engage back with the reading. So this is like a classic, and I do not put this in here to go, this is not what you should be doing. But it's just to demonstrate some of where this inadvertent reinforcement comes in. And while I completely understand picking battles, this might be how a cycle with a particular kid starts. And it's us sort of unpicking those cycles, right, together. So the first sort of element of reinforcement is the escape behavior. So they've left reading time, they've gotten up, they've gone to the trains, they have access to preferred activity, right? Positive reinforcement, something pleasant has been put into the environment following a behavior. Increases the likelihood of behavior. However, we get this instance of negative reinforcement after the escalation of the child's aggression, verbal aggression, we would say. Child has escalated to, no, leave me alone. I want to play with hate guided reading. And it's at that point that the teacher goes, oh, this is too much. We're not going to be able to get this done. Ignore you up there. If you're not interested, we're not interested. So teacher withdraws that instruction or that expectation to come back, taking something pleasant out of the environment. That behavior of the child, that escalated behavior, has been negatively reinforced, right? So that's one instance of negative reinforcement. But I think the most interesting part about this, because we all knew that was coming, right? We all knew that was an obvious thing, is that we're not only shaping kids' behaviors, kids are shaping our behaviors as well. And actually, in this instance, the teacher here has also been negatively reinforced because once they have withdrawn their instruction, once they have sort of opted out of the battle, so to speak, the child's behavior, escalated behavior, immediately ceases. They quieten down, they stop yelling, they stop interrupting, they're playing quietly, trades by themselves. So that unpleasant experience has been removed from the teacher's environment. And so the teacher's withdrawal behavior has been negatively reinforced by how the child has responded. The teacher's behavior has been shaped by the child's response, right? And so it means that next time in that situation, the teacher may be more likely to do this because the learning process has sort of sent this message that this has been an effective way. And so it's this dynamic and back and forth process. And you can see how this plays out with parents so often that they get stuck in these cycles where kids tantrum. And we see this from little tiny ones all the way up to sort of adolescence, where kids tantrum or get aggressive or threaten. And at that point, the parent goes, oh, you know what, too high. And so they withdraw. And it means that next time the pair is in that situation, the kid is going to start at that point because that was the thing that was affected last time. So they're going to start at that point of aggression or tantrum. And you can see then how this process leads to increasingly disruptive behavior. If it went the other way, where in a parent situation at least, where the child yells and says, no, I'm not going to do it, the parent escalates up once more instead of withdrawing, like the teacher in this example, and goes, you will do it. If you don't, you will get a smack. And then the child says, no, I'm not going to do it. And then the parent smacks the child, right? And that's the point at which the child goes, okay, I'll do it. That behavior has been withdrawn from the parent's environment. The parent has been reinforced for that smacking behavior. which means that potentially next time that's the level they're going to start at. And so you can see then how this type of trap can lay the groundwork for having a kid who's very, very disruptive and severe, and or a parent who's very, very harsh into sort of an abusive territory. Obviously, with teachers, it's not going to escalate from the teacher's end to that point because that's illegal, but it's going to be less likely that the teacher's going to escalate up. But kids' behavior will escalate. So that's sort of like the takeaway from this point, that this even sort of fairly inoffensive cycle could be where more aggressive or more disruptive cycle begins, because the next time the child's probably going to start at that more escalated level to get more and more aggressive until the next person gives in. So that's sort of the reinforcement trap. And so the sort of takeaway is that the main reason why kids do the things they do is because it's worked. And they've learned that it's worked in previous experiences. They use and they repeat behaviors that get results quickly, right? And so what I mentioned before is that sometimes punishments aren't actually functioning as punishers. They might actually be reinforcing the classic one being attention. Some attention, even if it's negative, even if it's being yelled at, is better than no attention for some kids. I see this a lot with kids of parents who are depressed, where they've really flattened their emotions. They sort of give nothing. The child does something that's disruptive, and the parent almost comes alive, even if they're angry. But for a kid who needs to connect emotionally with their attachment figure, that's better than no connection whatsoever, that negative attention. So keeping that in mind, try and understand what purpose this behavior is serving for this particular kid in this particular situation. And so what I'm going to talk about now is like this idea of what are the functions of behavior. And this might be something that you have some familiarity with. It's quite common when we work with kids who have autism spectrum disorder. But I find across the board, regardless of typical kid, atypical kid, whatever they've got going on, sometimes with really hard kids in particular, it is overwhelming to know where to start. And it's like, I feel like I'm caught up in this thing where I can't sort of get anything to work with this kid. And I am unclear about what sets them off, or it's unpredictable day to day. Thinking about particular situations, thinking about what function behaviors are serving, and then trying to figure out the triggers and the consequences in terms of how we respond can help us sort of like give us somewhere to start of trying to tweak things. So functions of behavior, this is distilling behavior down, it's simplifying it. And I know behavior is infinitely more complex than this. But once again, as a jumping off point, is this kid doing something? Is this kid doing this with the function of trying to get attention of some sort? This is you to look at them, touch them, talk to them, whatever it is, all their peers around them. Are they doing it to obtain something tangible? iPad, snack, toy, whatever. Are they doing it in order to get out of, to delay, or to completely escape something that they find unpleasant? Are they doing it to obtain, like to get sensory stimulation, or are they doing it to escape sensory stimulation? So you can see this a lot with ASD v ADHD. So with ASD, this is a kid who might cover their ears with loud noises, leave the room with lots of sensory stimulation going on. They do something in order to escape that. With ADHD, there tends to be a higher need for stimulation. And so this is where you get the rocking, you get the tapping, because their brains are comfier or sort of at peace with a higher level of stimulation than what a typical child or a typical person needs. So they're doing things in order to get stimulation. So distilling it down even further, do we want to get it, get out of it, get it, or get out of it, right? So these are like, once again, behavior is infinitely more complex than this, but going through in the moment, and this is something that I will do when I'm working with a child in the moment and something is happening, these are the sort of check boxes almost that I go through my head to come up with a hypothesis of what could be happening to this child in this moment. Either trying to get attention, get something tangible, escape or avoid something, or obtain more a higher level of sensory stimulation. Sort of that checklist. And so then what I'm doing in my head as my next step is I'm observing the behavior, what's happening in front of me. What is the child doing? What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I noticing? I'm thinking, what happened immediately before this behavior? What could be a potential trigger here? Where was the child? What were they doing? Who were they speaking to? what did I just do prior to the behavior happening, right? What's happening immediately before the antecedent? And then the behaviors happen. How did the world respond? What did I do? What did my face look like? What did my voice do? How did I respond behaviorally, verbally? What did the kids around the child do? How did they respond on their faces, with their words, their bodies? How did the world respond to this particular behavior? And based on that, we can start to hypothesize about what function this behavior is serving for this child. Are they trying to get something out of something? And depending on how the world responded, does this mean that they're likely to work? Was there a reinforcement happening, right? Are they likely to do this again in the future? So, a couple of examples. We might not go through all of these, but we can. They could be useful. So you have a kid who the behavior is, if we describe what is the child doing, what can we see, what can we hear, they lie down on the table, they go limp, they go sort of loosey noodle, closing their eyes, covering their heads with their arms. So that's the behavior I can see happening in front of me, right? What has happened immediately before this behavior? What were the potential triggers for this behavior? Well, what was happening is that a spelling test was distributed to the class, right? A sheet, there's a spelling practice. And so I go, okay, so this is what happened. This is what the behavior was. How did the world around this child respond? So at first, there was attention from the teacher. The teacher noticed, walked over, asked what was wrong, asked what was happening to the child. Say, okay, well, you don't have to do them all. Just give them a crack. Why do we do the first 5? That child has just like completely blanked no response, no immovable sack of potatoes, nothing doing. And so then eventually the teacher goes, okay, you just sit there quietly, you can do it. And moves away then to help the other students. So then we go, okay, function. This is a pretty obvious one. What has happened here is that the child has wanted to do the get out of, so escape or avoid a task that they find unpleasant. And in terms of whether or not this has been reinforced, if the function is to get out of the spelling test and not do it at all, then yes, reinforcement has happened because the teacher has gone, okay, you just sit and if you can do it, you can do it. And they've walked away and left the child do it. So the function has been achieved, which means that potentially this behavior is going to happen again in a similar situation next time. However, if the behavior had been to get attention, get input from the teacher, at first this function was achieved, but eventually the teacher walked away and left the child there by themselves. So if the function of the behavior in this case for the child had been to get attention from the people around them, but the teacher wasn't really sort of invested in a long term in this conversation, the kids weren't, they were concentrating on their own thing, this function wouldn't have been achieved. We might not see this behavior again if that was the function of the child's behavior, intended function, right? But I think it's pretty obvious in this case that it was the get out. And so, yes, this was reinforced. Another example, a child is talking loudly while another student is giving a speech, public speaking time. Immediately prior to that, what has happened? What could we see the child doing? What could we notice about the situation? You heard the child say, this is attention is on the student, giving speech, which makes sense. Everyone's being expected to sit down on the ground and pay attention, sit still. How did the world respond? There was a verbal reprimand from the teacher, saying, we are listening now, we are listening to the speech. The focus has shifted from the student giving the speech to the student who's misbehaving, who's calling out. Other students have laughed. This kid saying, is it boring? There's been some of that response from the peers. And so then if we talk about function, attention, tangible, escape or avoid something unpleasant, observe, obtain or avoid sensory stimulation, we go, okay, if what is happening here is that the student is seeking out attention, were they successful in achieving this function? They were. Attention from the teacher, attention from peers, this behavior has been reinforced, it's likely to increase. If the function was for the student to escape or avoid something unpleasant, potentially there's temporary reinforcement of that, but the teacher then says, okay, carry on to the student given the speech. potentially this behavior ultimately, even if the function was to avoid this unpleasant task of listening to somebody else give the speech, potentially this behavior then wasn't reinforced. We might not see this kid do it again if that was the function of their behavior. If that was the function of their behavior of wanting to escape or avoid this unpleasant task of listening, and the teacher said, "That is so rude, you need to leave the room now and stand outside the door away from me to come and talk to you," potentially that function would have been reinforced. So it's sort of like this is sort of the artistry of trying to figure out what is going on with these kids and their behaviors is if the behavior happens again, if you're noticing an escalation of the behavior, that gives you clues that the intended function was reinforced with how the world, how the other kids responded. So that gives you some information to work with to figure out, okay, is there another way then that we need to react or respond? These situations are hard. I'm not saying that there's like, this wouldn't be how it all went down. There may not be other options, but just to sort of illustrate how these things can unfold. So another example, leaving seat, distracting students in response to a difficult maths task, bit of frustration there, maybe a bit of embarrassment, faces red. This is you sort of guessing. What happens is that the child is sent to the back of the classroom, SLSO, sent to the office to an executive. And once again, this idea of wanting to avoid or escape something aversive, potentially reinforced if they are sent to the office. Potentially not if they sent to the SLSO and they still have to do the task. So again, it's monitoring how the child is responding in the moment, but then in future instances, thereafter, to see whether the intervention had the intended effect of reinforcing or not particular behaviours. I want to use the ABC sort of example to talk about how we might start unpacking that cycle, or the one that we went through just before, because these things can happen in chains. So you have a kid who refuses or says no to being told to stop playing the computer. The teacher it gives attention, moves closer, calls the student by name. Other students also give attention, eye contact, laughing. Teacher issues a request in a louder, more stern voice to turn off the computer. So what's happened here is that we have potentially multiple functions getting out of sort of something unpleasant, which is turning off the computer, or getting something tangible, which is getting more computer time. So potentially reinforcement has happened. But what we can see then is that the chains come. So the teacher has requested in a more stern voice that the student turns off the computer. How does the student then respond? What's the child's behavior in response? That's the escalation, where the student even more loudly says no. And so what was the reaction initially from the teacher now becomes a trigger for the next behavior in the cycle. And so that is how that behavior then becomes more likely next time. And that's potentially where the child's going to start next time. They're going to start at the louder no, the louder refusal, because that was ultimately what was reinforced. So this is how I would start breaking down that cycle, is by going, okay, tell me about the behaviors and you responded, and how did the child behave in response to that? And what did you do in response to that? So ultimately, I always sort of get to the point of, okay, so who won? Who ultimately had their will respected? Did the child end up doing the thing, or did the teacher end up withdrawing? And that's sort of how, when we get to the sort of the bitter end of that interaction, we'll figure out the ultimate reinforcement contingency. What was ultimately learned by each party in this particular interaction? And is this playing out day by day? But this is actually where we are going to leave it today. This is the last slide, which is just to say that hopefully where we can start getting some common ground, where it gives us a language or a jumping off point to talk about hate. And talking about the functions and trying to figure out the functions using the ABC is a very helpful tool for, like I said before, breaking it down, understanding how one thing lead to another and how that might play out for particular kids, and going, okay, well, I'm assuming that what they're trying to get out of it is this. Could it be something else? And hence, the way that I'm responding is inadvertently reinforcing that other function or the behavior that leads to that function. And I use this all the time. So I don't know if any of you are super familiar with PCIT yet, but what happens is a lot of coaching in real time coaching. So the child's in a room with the parent's wearing an earpiece, and I'm sort of coaching the parents to shift their behaviors in response to the child sort of unfolding whatever they're doing in front of the room. And I remember this one situation where I did this in a really sort of clear way because it wasn't immediately obvious to me what was happening to this child. And I remember a clinical psych student observing me. I was teaching them how to do PCIT. And we'd gone through the whole PCIT process with this particular kid. He'd done a really good job. His dad was there. He was using the PCIT skills beautifully. And the dad had just given him an instruction to do something. And the child sort of had done it, but then had walked up from the desk, laid on the ground, and sort of was doing the head covering the hands, then looking really upset, sort of verbalizing that he didn't want to be there anymore. And this is the first time I'd ever seen this behavior. So my mind immediately goes into functional analysis. What could be happening here? Okay, the kid could be trying to bring the dad over to get some attention, to get some input, to get some sort of interaction happening because he had some sort of other need. Maybe he had a bad day and he just needed that input from dad. One particular function. Another function might be that he wanted to avoid or delay having to do more instructions from dad to comply with what dad was telling him to do in the play. So it could have been avoid escape. He hadn't needed to do that in the past. So I was like, maybe it's a function. So I coached dad saying, looks like he needs a little bit of input from you. Why don't you walk up, sit next to him, give him a pat on the back, let him know that you're there for him, have a bit of a chat about what's going on. Child doesn't engage with dad, and dad notices that there's a slight smirk on the child's face. And so then sort of feeds that back to me, and I go, okay, potentially that was not the right function. Potentially attention from dad wasn't what the ultimate goal here was. So then we switched into the theory that potentially the kid wanted to just get out of doing more compliance stuff. I said, Dad, go back and give a child another instruction. And the child struggled to do it, but eventually complied, sat down and re-engaged back into the plan. And so I was talking with my student afterwards, and she was like, I think you got that wrong initially. And I was like, yes. And that is fine because we are not mind readers. We do not know what's happening for children in the moment. And what these strategies of thinking about function, doing an ABC does is give us ways to hypothesize or theorize about behavior. And it gives us options for then how we manage it. And if our management strategies aren't effective in the outcome that we're seeking, that gives us a clue that we need to shift gears. And so these sorts of theories give us a way to talk about behavior both after the fact when we're debriefing with one another, but also in the moment where we're observing something unfolding in front of us and we're going, what is going on here? Okay, it could be X, Y, and Z. It gives us something to hang our hat on. So I just share that example to bring these ideas to life a little bit and let you know that this is, it can be something that has potential to be really useful. And we're going to use it as a jumping off point then when we talk about all of the practical strategies in our next couple of workshops together, because this is the way that we'll choose when to use a particular strategy, in what situation, for what type of kit. That's really the goal.